This is my true story. My son disappeared 31 years ago after a terrible argument, and I never saw him again. I searched for him everywhere, but the police eventually closed the case and everyone told me to move on. But last Tuesday, someone knocked on my door, and when I opened it, I saw my son standing there looking older but still recognizable. He said he was home, and I cried with joy. We spent a week together, and he apologized for everything. But then I started noticing shocking things that did not add up and discovered a secret that destroyed me. Before I tell you what I discovered, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My son vanished when he was 19 years old, and that day destroyed my life in ways I can never fully explain. We had a bitter argument about his future one evening in our living room. I wanted him to go to college and make something of himself. He wanted to travel and find himself and not be tied down to expectations. The argument escalated and terrible things were said on both sides. He told me I was controlling and suffocating him. I told him he was irresponsible and wasting his potential. He stormed out of the house and I expected him to come back after cooling down like he always did. But he never came back. Days passed with no word from him. I called his friends and they said they had not seen him. I drove around the city looking for him, checking all the places he used to hang out. After a week, I filed a missing person report with the police. They took his information and his photo, but they said most young adults who leave home voluntarily turn up eventually. They said he was probably just staying with friends and would contact me when he was ready. But weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of him. I hired private investigators who searched for him but found nothing. I checked homeless shelters and hospitals with his photo clutched in my shaking hands, asking everyone if they had seen my boy. I put up missing person posters all over the city. I appeared on local news broadcasts begging him to come home, or at least let me know he was safe. But there was only silence. My son had vanished completely, as if he had never existed. The not knowing was torture worse than any other pain I had experienced. Years went by, and the case went cold. The police eventually closed the file, saying there was nothing more they could do. They said my son was an adult who had left voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play. My friends and family slowly stopped asking about him. They stopped bringing up his name because it was too painful, and because they had accepted he was gone. The world moved on, but I never did. I could not move on because I did not know if my son was alive or dead or suffering somewhere needing me. I carried the ghost of my boy through 3 decades of wondering and waiting. Every time the phone rang, my heart would jump, thinking maybe this time it would be him. Every time there was a knock at the door, I would hope it was my son coming home. I saw him in crowds on the street only to get closer and realize it was a stranger who just happened to look similar. I dreamed about him almost every night. Sometimes the dreams were happy memories of when he was young. Sometimes they were nightmares about what might have happened to him. I kept his bedroom exactly as he left it. His clothes still hung in the closet. His posters still covered the walls. His books still sat on the shelves. I cleaned his room every week, dusting everything and keeping it ready for him in case he ever came back. People told me I needed to move on and accept that he was gone. They said keeping his room like a shrine was unhealthy. But I could not let go. Letting go felt like giving up on him, and I would never give up on my son. The grief never got easier. Some people say time heals all wounds, but that is not true when you do not have closure. Not knowing what happened to my son meant the wound stayed fresh and raw for 31 years. Every birthday and every holiday and every milestone that passed without him was another reminder of what I had lost. I aged decades in those years, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unfulfilled hope. I blamed myself constantly for the argument that drove him away. I replayed that night over and over in my mind, thinking about what I could have said differently. If I had just been less harsh. If I had just listened more. If I had just let him make his own choices without judgment. Maybe he would have stayed. Maybe he would have come back. The guilt and the grief consumed me for 3 decades until last Tuesday, when everything changed in a way I never expected. Last Tuesday, at exactly 7 in the evening, someone knocked on my front door. I was sitting in my living room watching television and barely paying attention to the show. I had been living alone for so long that unexpected visitors were rare. Most of my friends had passed away or moved to be closer to their families. I got up slowly from my chair and walked to the door, wondering who it could be. Maybe a delivery person, or someone selling something, or a neighbor needing help. The knock had a specific rhythm that stopped me in my tracks. 3 quick raps followed by a pause, and then 2 more raps. It was a pattern I had not heard in 31 years, but I recognized it instantly. My son used to knock exactly that way when he came home late and did not want to startle me. He had done it since he was a teenager. The memory hit me so hard I almost could not breathe. My hands started shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I opened the door, and the world stopped. Standing on my porch was a man who looked about 50 years old. His hair was gray, and his face was weathered with lines and wrinkles. He was heavier than I remembered, and his clothes were worn work clothes. But his eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes I had stared into when he was a baby. The same eyes I had seen every day for 19 years before he disappeared. My son's eyes were looking back at me after 3 decades. He said, "Dad," and his voice cracked with emotion. He said, "I am home." Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. My vision blurred with tears. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. This could not be real. This had to be a dream or a hallucination. But he was standing there solid and real and calling me Dad. Impossible joy and confusion collided in my chest. I wanted to grab him and hug him and never let go. But I also could not process what was happening. How was he here? Where had he been for 31 years? Why had he stayed away so long? Why had he never contacted me? The questions flooded my mind, but I could not speak. I just stood there staring at him with tears streaming down my face. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. The hug was tight and desperate, like he was afraid I would disappear. I felt his body shaking with sobs against mine. I hugged him back automatically, my arms moving on their own while my brain tried to catch up with reality. This was my son. My boy, who had been missing for 3 decades, was standing on my porch, hugging me. The moment felt surreal and overwhelming. We stood there in the doorway for several minutes, just holding each other and crying. Neighbors walking by probably thought we looked insane. 2 men sobbing on a front porch in the evening. But I did not care what anyone thought. My son had come home. The prayers I had said for 31 years had finally been answered. The waiting was over. The wondering was over. He was here and he was alive, and that was all that mattered in that moment. Finally, I pulled back and looked at his face. I studied every line and wrinkle, trying to find the 19-year-old boy I remembered in this 50-year-old man. He was there in glimpses. The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, the way his mouth moved when he tried to smile through tears. I saw my son in this stranger's face, and I felt a rush of love so intense it hurt. I pulled him inside and closed the door. I led him to the living room and we sat on the couch. I could not stop touching him. I kept putting my hand on his shoulder or his arm to make sure he was real. He kept saying, "I am sorry, Dad," over and over. He kept saying he was so sorry for everything, and I kept telling him it was okay, and that all that mattered was he was home. In that moment, I believed every word. I had my son back, and nothing else mattered. He stepped further into my home and moved around like he had never left. He walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet where I kept the glasses exactly where they had always been. He poured himself water from the tap and drank it, standing in the same spot he used to stand as a teenager. He looked around the living room and commented that I had kept everything almost the same. He pointed to the couch and said that was where he used to fall asleep watching movies. Every movement and gesture seemed familiar and right. He hugged me again with desperate intensity that felt real and raw. He held on like he was afraid to let go. He said he had missed me every single day. He said not a day went by that he did not think about me and regret leaving. His voice was thick with emotion and tears kept rolling down his face. He apologized endlessly for the pain he had caused me. He said he was sorry for disappearing and for never reaching out and for wasting 31 years we could have spent together. He explained that after our argument, he had hitchhiked across the country trying to clear his head. He said he ended up in a small town in another state, and started working construction to survive. He said the anger and shame from our fight had spiraled him into dark places mentally. He said he fell into depression and isolation. He said he convinced himself that I was better off without him. He said he built a new life working on construction sites and moving from town to town, never staying anywhere too long. He said he had wanted to contact me so many times over the years, but he was afraid. He was afraid I would reject him after he had abandoned me. He was afraid too much time had passed and it would be too awkward. He was afraid I had moved on and did not want him back in my life. So he stayed away, even though it tore him apart inside. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life, and he regretted it every single day for 3 decades. He cried appropriately at all the right moments. When he talked about our argument, his voice broke with regret. When he talked about missing my birthday and holidays, his eyes filled with tears. When he talked about imagining what my life had been like without him, he sobbed openly. Every emotional beat seemed genuine and authentic. He said all the right words about regret and wasted years and wanting to make up for lost time. His performance was flawless. Something felt rehearsed about the way he spoke. His story was almost too smooth and too well constructed. The details came out in a logical order, without any of the confusion or messiness of real memory. When people tell true stories, they backtrack and correct themselves and remember things out of order. But his story flowed perfectly from beginning to end, like he had practiced it many times. The way he delivered certain lines felt scripted, like an actor who had memorized his part. But I was drowning in relief and joy, and I pushed my doubts aside. I told myself I was being paranoid and suspicious for no reason. This was my son who had come home after 31 years. Of course he had rehearsed what he would say to me. Of course he had thought through how to explain his absence. That did not mean he was lying. That just meant he had prepared himself for this difficult reunion. I convinced myself that my skepticism was unfair and that I should just be grateful he was here. I wanted so desperately to believe that my prayers had been answered. I wanted to believe my son had finally come home. The alternative was too painful to consider. If this was not really my son, then I had to accept that my boy was still missing or dead. I could not face that possibility. So I chose to believe. I chose to ignore the small voice in my head saying something was wrong. I chose to embrace this man as my son and welcome him back into my life. It was the biggest mistake I could have made. Over the next week, he stayed with me in my house, sleeping in the guest room. I offered him his old bedroom, but he said he wanted me to keep it the way it was because it meant so much to me. That seemed thoughtful and considerate at the time. We spent hours talking and catching up, and I tried to reconnect with the son I thought I had lost. But small details kept feeling wrong in ways I could not quite explain. Little things that did not match my memories but that I tried to excuse or rationalize away. He could not remember our dog's name. We had a golden retriever named Charlie who had been his best friend growing up. That dog slept in his room and followed him everywhere. When I mentioned Charlie in conversation, he looked confused and said, "Oh, right, the dog." He could not remember the dog's name until I said it. He claimed 31 years had made some memories fuzzy. But you do not forget your childhood dog's name. That is the kind of detail that stays with you forever, no matter how much time passes. He got confused about which room had been his childhood bedroom. When I mentioned something about his room, he pointed to the wrong door. He pointed to what had always been a storage closet. When I gently corrected him, he laughed and said he had gotten turned around. He blamed it on the house looking different than he remembered. But the layout of the house had not changed. A person does not forget which room they slept in for 19 years. That confusion bothered me deeply. He told stories about our past that never actually happened. He talked about a fishing trip we supposedly took when he was 12, where we caught a huge bass. We never went on that fishing trip. I hate fishing, and we never did it together. He described a birthday party where I made him a chocolate cake with blue frosting. I never made him that cake. His birthday cakes were always vanilla because he was allergic to chocolate as a child. The stories sounded good, and they were the kind of memories a father and son might share. But they were not our memories. When I gently corrected him about these false stories, he would laugh and blame 31 years of forgetting. He would say memory is a tricky thing and that he must be mixing up details. He would say he had probably confused me with someone else or merged different memories together. He always had a plausible explanation for why he was wrong. But the explanations started to pile up. 1 or 2 memory mistakes would be normal, but there were dozens of them. Major details and minor details all wrong. A father knows his son's memories. I had spent 19 years building memories with my boy. I knew every story and every experience we had shared. These were not memories that had faded over time. These were memories that had never existed in the first place. They were fabricated stories that someone who did not actually live through them would tell. They were the kind of generic father-son memories that anyone could imagine. Fishing trips and birthday cakes and family vacations. But they were not ours. I started watching him more carefully after that. I started testing him with questions about our past. What was his favorite meal I used to cook? What was the name of his best friend in high school? What car did I drive when he was growing up? He got some answers right, but he got just as many wrong. The ones he got right were probably details he could have learned from research or from asking people who knew us. The ones he got wrong revealed that he did not actually have the lived experience of being my son. I wanted to confront him, but I was afraid. I was afraid of what it would mean if this man was not actually my son. I was afraid of losing him again after just getting him back. So I stayed quiet and watched and collected evidence of all the things that did not add up. I told myself maybe I was wrong. Maybe his memory really was that damaged. But deep down, I was starting to know the horrible truth. I could not sleep that night. Something about the accumulation of wrong details had finally broken through my desperate need to believe. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we had over the past week. The more I thought about it, the more nothing made sense. The wrong memories. The confusion about basic facts. The rehearsed quality of his emotional moments. My gut was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong, even though my heart wanted to deny it. Around 2 in the morning, I heard his voice coming from the guest room. He was talking to someone on the phone. His voice was low, but I could hear him through the quiet house. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and moved down the hallway toward the guest room. My heart was pounding as I approached the door. I pressed my ear against it to hear what he was saying. What I heard made my blood turn to ice. His voice sounded completely different than it had all week. The emotion was gone. The warmth was gone. His tone was cold and calculated and businesslike. He said, "I am in, and the old man believes everything." He said the birth certificate and photos worked perfectly. He was talking about documents he had used to convince me he was my son. He was talking about me like I was a target or a mark, like I was someone he was running a scam on. He continued talking, and I heard him say he had access to the house now, and that the accounts should be accessible within a month. He was talking about my bank accounts and my assets. He was discussing how long it would take to get control of my money. He mentioned something about power of attorney and how he needed to convince me to sign papers. My entire body went cold as I realized what was happening. This man was not my son. He was a criminal who had researched my missing son and come here to rob me. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. He told someone named Marcus that this job was easier than they expected because I was so desperate to believe. He said lonely old men with missing kids were the perfect targets because they wanted so badly for their children to come home that they ignored obvious red flags. He was talking about me like I was pathetic and stupid. He was mocking my grief and my hope while planning to steal everything I owned. I stood there in the dark hallway with my ear pressed against the door, listening to this stranger plot against me. Tears were streaming down my face, but they were not tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of rage and betrayal and humiliation. I had welcomed this man into my home. I had cried tears of joy when I saw him. I had believed every lie he told me because I wanted so desperately for my son to be alive. And he had used that desperation against me like a weapon. He said something about needing to stay in character and keep the old man convinced for a few more weeks. He said once he had the power of attorney signed, he could start moving money and assets. He said Marcus should have the fake documents ready for the next phase. He laughed again and said this was going to be the easiest $100,000 they ever made. They had calculated exactly how much they thought they could steal from me before I caught on or before someone else got suspicious. I backed away from the door, slowly trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could confront him right now, but he might become violent. I could call the police, but I needed proof of what he was planning. I went back to my bedroom and sat on my bed shaking with anger and grief. My son was not home. My son had not come back. This was a con artist who had researched my tragedy and come here to exploit my pain for money, and I had let him in. I had believed him. I had been fooled completely. The next morning, I waited until the imposter left the house, saying he needed to run some errands. As soon as his car was out of sight, I grabbed my phone and searched for private investigators in my area. I found one with good reviews who specialized in fraud cases and identity verification. I called and explained my situation. I said a man claiming to be my long-lost son had appeared, but I suspected he was not who he claimed to be. The investigator said he could help and asked me to come to his office immediately. I drove to his office with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I brought photos of my real son from when he was young. I brought the missing person report from 31 years ago. I brought everything I had that documented who my son actually was. The investigator was a middle-aged man named Robert who listened carefully as I explained everything. He took notes and asked detailed questions. He said this sounded like a sophisticated con and that he would need to move quickly before the imposter realized I was investigating. Robert took photos of the man claiming to be my son. I had several pictures on my phone from the past week. Robert also asked for anything the imposter had touched so he could potentially get fingerprints. I said he had been drinking from glasses and eating with silverware that I had not washed yet. Robert said that was perfect and that he would send someone to collect those items. He said he would run the fingerprints and the photos through databases and see what came back. The results came back in 48 hours. Robert called me and asked me to come back to his office. His tone on the phone was serious and grim. I knew before I got there that the news would be bad. When I sat down across from his desk, he slid a file folder toward me. He said he had found out who the man in my house really was. He said the results were devastating, but I needed to know the truth. The file contained a police record for a man named Thomas Brennan. The photo was unmistakably the same man who had been sleeping in my guest room and calling me Dad. Thomas Brennan had a long criminal history, including fraud and identity theft and elder exploitation. He had been arrested multiple times in different states for similar scams. He was 47 years old, not 50. He had never worked construction. Everything he told me was a lie, constructed to manipulate me. Robert explained that Thomas was part of a sophisticated fraud ring that targeted elderly parents of missing children. They would research cold cases and find families who had spent decades searching for lost loved ones. They would study the missing person's background and find someone in their group who resembled them. They would create fake documents like birth certificates and school records. Then they would send that person to the family home to pose as the long-lost child. The scam worked because grieving parents wanted so desperately to believe their loved ones had returned. The con artists knew that hope and grief made people overlook inconsistencies. They knew that after decades of wondering and searching, people would accept even a flawed reunion rather than face continued uncertainty. The fraud ring had perfected the approach through years of targeting vulnerable families. They knew exactly what to say and how to act to exploit parental love. Robert said Thomas and his accomplice Marcus had targeted at least a dozen families that investigators knew about. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars by convincing desperate parents to sign over power of attorney or give them access to bank accounts. They would stay with the families for weeks or months building trust. Then they would disappear with whatever money they could steal, leaving the families devastated and broke. But Robert said there was something else in the file I needed to see. Something worse than the con. He pulled out another set of documents and placed them in front of me. He said while investigating Thomas Brennan, he had also looked deeper into what really happened to my actual son. And what he found was information that had been sitting in a database for 29 years, but had never been connected to my missing person case. Robert showed me documents from a coroner's office in Nevada, dated 29 years ago. The documents detailed an unidentified body found in a car accident on a remote highway outside of Las Vegas. A single vehicle collision where a car had gone off the road and crashed into a ravine. The driver had been killed instantly. The body had been badly burned in the fire that followed the crash. Identification had been difficult because the driver was carrying fake identification documents and no wallet with real information. The coroner's office had taken fingerprints and dental records, but the victim had no criminal record, and the dental records did not match any missing persons in their immediate database. This was before the sophisticated national databases we have now. Back then, information sharing between states was limited and slow. The body had been buried in a county cemetery under the name from the fake ID, John Davis, a name that meant nothing and belonged to no one real. But Robert had run the fingerprints through modern databases and found a match. The prints belonged to my son. The unidentified body that had been buried as John Davis 29 years ago was actually my boy. My son had died just 2 years after he disappeared. He had been gone for 29 years, and I never knew. I had spent 3 decades searching and hoping and waiting while his body lay in an unmarked grave in Nevada under a false name. Robert explained that my son had apparently been using the fake ID to work under the table and avoid being found. Many young people who run away from home do this to stay hidden from family or from authorities. The fake ID explained why the coroner could not identify him. It explained why no one had connected the accident victim to my missing person report. The systems failed, and my son fell through the cracks. He died alone and was buried alone, and I never got to say goodbye. The accident report showed that alcohol had been involved. My son had been driving drunk on a dark highway in the middle of the night. He lost control of the vehicle and crashed. The investigators believed he died quickly without suffering. That was supposed to be a comfort, but it was not. My son had been 21 years old, driving drunk and alone in the desert. He had died 2 years after our argument. 2 years of him being out there alive while I searched, and 2 years of me not knowing he was already gone. Robert showed me photos from the accident scene. I should not have looked, but I needed to see. The burned wreckage of a car at the bottom of a ravine. The desert landscape around it empty and isolated. This was where my son had died. Not in some hospital where I could have been called. Not in some accident where someone who knew him was there. He died alone on an empty highway and was buried as John Davis, with no one to mourn him properly. The coroner's office had kept his personal effects in storage all these years. Robert had contacted them and arranged for the items to be sent to me. A box arrived 2 days later containing everything my son had on him when he died. A cheap watch that had stopped at the time of impact. A lighter, some change, a few photographs that had somehow survived. One of the photos was of me and him from when he was a child. He had kept it with him. Even after running away and using a fake name, he had kept a photo of us together. I held that burned photograph in my hands, and I cried harder than I had cried in 31 years. My son had not abandoned me completely. He had carried a reminder of me even while hiding from his past. Maybe he had planned to come back someday. Maybe he had regretted running away. I would never know. All I knew was that my boy had died young and alone and had been buried in an unmarked grave while I searched desperately for him, never knowing he was already gone. The con artist in my guest room was not just stealing my money. He was stealing my grief and my hope and dancing on the grave of my real son. I called the police from Robert's office and explained everything. I showed them the evidence that Thomas Brennan was a con artist and that he was currently living in my house under false pretenses. The police said they would send officers to my home that evening to arrest him. They told me to act normal when I went home and not to confront him until they arrived. They said con artists like this could become dangerous if they realized they had been caught. I agreed to wait for them, but I knew I needed to face this man myself first. I went home and found him sitting on my couch watching television like he belonged there. He smiled when I walked in and asked how my day had been. He called me Dad with that fake warmth in his voice. I looked at him and felt nothing but rage and disgust. This man had researched my tragedy and studied my pain and used it against me. He had pretended to be my dead son to steal my money. He had made me believe a lie that gave me hope just so he could rob me. I told him I needed to talk to him about something important. I asked him to come to the kitchen table. He followed me, looking slightly concerned but still playing his role. I had spread all the evidence across the kitchen table. The police records showing his real identity, the fingerprint analysis, the photos of his previous arrests, the documentation of his fraud ring, and most painfully, the coroner's report showing my real son had died 29 years ago in Nevada. I looked him in the eyes and said, "You are not my son." My voice was shaking but steady. I said my son died 29 years ago in a car accident and was buried in Nevada under a fake name. I said, "You are Thomas Brennan, and you came here to rob a grieving father." I said the police were on their way, and he was going to prison for what he had done to me and to other families. I wanted to see his face when he realized his con had failed. His mask dropped instantly. The warm, concerned expression vanished. The fake tears and emotion disappeared. What replaced it was cold calculation and rage at being caught. His eyes went hard and his jaw clenched. He said nothing for a moment, just stared at the evidence on the table. Then he looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You stupid old man." He said I could have gotten away with this if I had just a few more weeks. He said I should have signed the power of attorney documents faster. He started saying cruel things meant to hurt me. He said I was pathetic and desperate and easy to fool. He said my real son probably killed himself to get away from me. He said no wonder my son never came home if this was what he had to come back to. Every word was designed to wound me as deeply as possible. He wanted to hurt me because I had ruined his scam. He wanted to make me feel the pain he felt at being caught. He suddenly lunged toward the back door, trying to escape before the police arrived. But I had anticipated this. I had unlocked the front door before sitting him down, and police officers were already entering the house. They had been waiting outside for my signal. 3 officers came through the door with their hands on their weapons. They ordered Thomas to get on the ground. He froze halfway to the door and looked back at me with rage in his eyes. The officers handcuffed him and read him his rights. He struggled and shouted and threatened to sue everyone. He claimed this was a misunderstanding and that he really was my son. But the officers had seen the evidence, and they were not listening to his lies. They led him out of my house in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their yards. The man who had pretended to be my son for a week was taken away to face justice for what he had done. I stood in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence of his fraud and my son's death. I felt empty and broken. The hope I had felt a week ago was gone. My son was never coming home. He had been dead for 29 years. Thomas Brennan's arrest became the breakthrough that law enforcement had been waiting for. The police detective handling my case said that investigators in multiple states had been tracking this fraud ring for years, but had never been able to gather enough evidence to make arrests stick. Victims were often too embarrassed to come forward, or were so emotionally devastated that they could not help with prosecution. But my case was different, because I had caught Thomas in the act before he could disappear, and because I had documented everything through the private investigator. The evidence from my case opened up the entire operation. Thomas's phone records showed communications with his accomplice Marcus and with at least 6 other members of the fraud ring operating in different parts of the country. His laptop contained detailed files on dozens of families they had researched and targeted. There were spreadsheets tracking missing children cases. There were notes on family financial situations. There were photos of potential victims and scripts for how to approach each family. The organization and planning that went into their crimes was shocking. The fraud operation had targeted 17 families across 6 states that investigators could document. There were probably more victims who never came forward or who never realized they had been conned. The ring had been operating for at least 8 years. They had stolen nearly $3 million from grieving parents who desperately wanted to believe their missing children had returned. Some families had been completely bankrupted. Some had signed over their homes. Some had emptied retirement accounts thinking they were helping their returned children start new lives. Arrests were made across multiple jurisdictions within 2 weeks of Thomas being taken into custody. Marcus was arrested in Arizona, along with 3 other core members of the ring. 2 more were arrested in Oregon. Another was arrested in Florida. Each arrest led to more evidence and more victims being identified. The FBI got involved because the crimes crossed state lines and involved identity theft and wire fraud. What started with my case became a massive federal investigation. The other victims started coming forward once the arrests made the news. Families who had been conned but were too ashamed to report it finally contacted authorities. Parents who had thought they were alone in being fooled realized there were others. A support group formed for the families who had been targeted. We shared our stories of how we had been manipulated and how these criminals had exploited our grief. The support group helped some of us process what had happened, but it also made the scope of the cruelty clearer. My case broke the ring wide open and gave other victims a path to justice. The prosecutor told me that without my evidence and my willingness to testify, the entire operation might have continued for years. She said my quick action and the work of my private investigator had saved potentially dozens of other families from being targeted. She said I should be proud that something good came from my pain. But I did not feel proud. I felt empty. The victims were finally getting justice, and the criminals were going to prison. Thomas Brennan was facing charges in multiple states for fraud and identity theft and elder exploitation. He was looking at decades in prison when all the cases were combined. Marcus and the others were facing similar sentences. Their cruel business of exploiting grieving parents was finished. They would spend their best years behind bars paying for what they had done to vulnerable families. But my justice felt hollow and meaningless. Yes, the man who pretended to be my son was going to prison. Yes, other families were saved from being victimized. But none of that changed the truth that hurt worse than anything. My real son was never coming home. My son had been dead for 29 years, and I had only just found out. The con artist had not just stolen my money or my trust. He had stolen a week of my life where I got to believe my son was alive. And when that illusion shattered, it revealed a truth that was worse than 3 decades of not knowing. Now I knew my son was dead and gone forever. I buried my son properly last month, 29 years too late. The state of Nevada exhumed his body from the unmarked county cemetery where he had been resting under the wrong name. They sent his remains back to me, and I arranged a funeral with a real headstone that bore his actual name. The funeral was small because most people who knew him when he was alive had moved away or passed on. But I was there, and that was what mattered. I finally got to say goodbye to my boy after 3 decades of waiting. The headstone reads his full name and his birth date and the date he actually died 29 years ago. Not the date I learned about his death, but the date it happened. I added an inscription that says, "Beloved son forever missed." I visit the cemetery twice a week now, and I talk to him. I tell him about my life, and I apologize for the argument that drove him away. I tell him I forgive him for running, and I ask him to forgive me for not finding him sooner. I know he cannot hear me, but it helps me process the grief. The imposter Thomas Brennan is serving 12 years in federal prison for fraud and elder exploitation. The judge gave him a harsh sentence because of the cruelty of his crimes and the number of families he victimized. I attended his sentencing and gave a victim impact statement. I told the court how he had used my grief as a weapon against me. I told them how he pretended to be my dead son to steal my money. I told them about the week I spent believing my prayers had been answered only to have that hope destroyed. The judge said Thomas deserved every year of his sentence. Sometimes in quiet moments I think about the week Thomas spent in my house pretending to be my son. Part of me is angry that he stole that time and filled it with lies. But another part of me is strangely grateful. Not grateful for the con or the lies, but grateful because his crime led me to the truth I had needed for 3 decades. If Thomas had never knocked on my door, I might have died, never knowing what happened to my son. I might have spent the rest of my life wondering and searching and hoping. The con artist gave me closure by stealing everything else. He took my trust and my money and my peace of mind. But in the process of investigating his fraud, I finally learned my son's fate. I learned that my son did not abandon me forever. I learned that he died young carrying a photo of us together. I learned where he was buried, and I was able to bring him home properly. The truth was devastating, but it was also freeing. The not knowing had been torture for 31 years. Now I know, and I can grieve properly. My son did not return after 31 years. A con artist wearing his face returned instead. But that con artist's crime solved a mystery that had haunted me for 3 decades. My real son died 29 years ago in Nevada. He was buried under a false name in an unmarked grave. He never abandoned me. He never forgot me. He just died young and alone, and the system failed to connect his death to my missing person report. Now he rests in a cemetery near my home where I can visit him and where his real name marks his grave. I live with 2 kinds of grief now. The old grief of losing my son, which I carried for 31 years, and the new grief of knowing exactly how and when I lost him. The old grief was about uncertainty and hope. The new grief is about finality and acceptance. Both hurt in different ways, but at least now I know the truth. At least now I can mourn properly. At least now when I visit his grave, I am visiting my actual son, not an empty memorial to someone who might still be alive somewhere. The imposter is in prison. The fraud ring is destroyed. My son is properly buried. And I finally have the closure I searched for since the day he walked out 31 years ago. The truth was worse than I imagined, but it was also better than not knowing. Now I can rest. Now my son can rest. We both finally have peace.